Chapter 10. The courtyard was bathed in blue lighting. The two police cars sat at angles to each other, with their front doors open and their lights flashing across the buildings on two sides. The occasional bleep, with electronic voices and static cutting through the air from the radios. Two policemen half sat on the bonnet of one with their ankles crossed and arms folded. One sniffed loudly, and their breath swirled around their heads in clouds and vanished. A short distance away, by the green railings, was another policeman, a pair of bolt crops in one hand, trying to look interested in what Marshall was saying to him. Marshall was waving his arms and then holding his head, then pointing to the railings. "You need to open it and look inside." Marshall made downward cutting motions with both hands to emphasise how definite this was. "That padlock wasn't there earlier, I swear." The policeman looked doubtful. "I can't just break in there without a good reason, sir." He gestured with the bolt crops. "We can approach the administration for a set of keys and we'll have a look then." "It's a crime scene, for God's sake," said Marshall. "The evidence will be gone by then. I'll buy a new lock if it makes you feel better." "There's no need for sarcasm, sir." The officer shot a glance at his colleagues. "I'll humour you, sir, but if we find nothing, it doesn't look good for you. I'll be honest." He turned and strode towards the stairs leading down, and Marshall fell in behind him, reticent, holding back and trying not to look like he was. They reached the bottom of the stone steps, a clip-on torch lighting the way, and the uniformed man raised the crops to cut the lock. He seemed to freeze and let them drop to his side. He took another step forward. Marshall could see him frowning in the torchlight. He removed the light from its clip on his vest and shone it on the lock. Marshall could see that the lock was the damaged one he'd seen on the ground only an hour or so before. "Ha!" exclaimed Marshall. "Now do you believe me?" This proves nothing, sir. It does mean we're not breaking and entering, though, which is something at least." The policeman pulled the lock free from its staple and dropped it on the ground. Marshall was already fumbling in his pocket for his master key, but the officer turned the handle and pushed. The door wasn't locked. The smell which greeted them was much as before, and a musty gust of air wafted past them dankly, accompanied by the rustle of wind-blown paper. The constable arched his torch beam across the space inside, and the light glinted back as it caught shiny particles on the floor, fragments of glass, foil and the like. The beam shone briefly through the opposite doorway, and shadows swung in a dance, conjuring up pictures in Marshall's mind, which picked at the scab of his resolve only recently healed. "Wait here, sir, while I take a look." "You can't go in there alone," said Marshall, more to bolster his own courage than out of concern for the police officer. "Then stay behind me," he replied, and Marshall had expected him to insist. "Should I call your colleagues?" No need, sir." And with that he took a step over the threshold. Marshall vacillated, but fell in rather too closely behind the uniformed man. He thrust his hands past the policeman's shoulders and pointed at the doorway. That's where the legs were, and the blood." He swept his hand back and forth. "Then they were dragged in." "Well, there doesn't seem to be any blood here, sir, does there?" He stood by the opening now, and the torch beam scanned the ground. "Not much sign of any dragging either, I'd say. Would you agree, Mr. He shone the torch in Marshall's face, causing him to screw up his eyes. "No, officer. I mean, yes. You're right, of course." The policeman took a step through the doorway and swung his torch this way and that, up and down, and then turned back, shining it in Marshall's face once more. He made a flicking gesture with it to indicate they should leave. Marshall was peering over the man's shoulder into the blackness. Then, reluctantly, despite not wanting to be down there, he turned and headed out the door. 4 hours later, and still smarting from the embarrassment, Marshall sat in his room chiding himself. He even went through the idea that he'd imagined the whole thing. "You're properly losing it, Marsh," he chided himself. "Must have been a trick of the shadows or something." It was then that it occurred to him that he should actually be at work. He wasn't given to panic. Working on a secure psychiatric ward will do that to you. But he knew he'd need to be pretty convincing to save his skin from Bundu. His imagination conjured a picture of himself falling through ice into dark water. He grimaced at the morbidity of his own imagination, and his thoughts scrabbled for a plausible lie while he made his way to the internal telephone at the end of the corridor from which to phone the ward. "Mail secure," said a Jamaican accent from the other end of the line. "Ken," said Marshall, "it's me." "I hope you's calling from China, spa. Bondo going blood clot kill you." "I have no Scooby what you just said, Kenneth, apart from the word Bundu. I'm going out on a limb and guess he's not happy. Not that he's the smiliest bloke I know, you understand." "That sense of humour not gonna save you unless you had a near fatal accident. The rest of us have had to put up with grunts and insults because of you. If anybody gets out alive, you owe them all beer, funny boy." Kenneth made a sucking noise through his teeth. "Point taken," said Marshall. "You'd best let me speak to him then." Marshall gritted his teeth while he waited, and then closed his eyes when he heard Bundu pick up the phone from the desk where Kenneth had left it. "Bundu," said Bundu. "Bundu," said Marshall. "It's me." "I know you. You used to work here." Sarcasm, Marshall mused to himself, was something new from Bundu. "I can explain, boss," replied Marshall, hoping that low-level deference would help his cause. "I've been with the police all morning. They had a report of something dodgy going on in the old basement wards on the F side of the hospital, and I showed them where to look. Not entirely a lie, just leaving out the fact that he himself had reported it." "You should write for the Daily Sport print. They're always looking for made-up shit to print." "It's true. You can ring them to check if you don't believe me." "What I believe is that you left us short on the floor. You let the team down, and it's not the safest place to work even at full strength." "You're right, of course. I'm sorry." "Not yet, but you will be. If you want to continue to work on my team, you owe me 2 random shifts, starting with a long day tomorrow, and another of my choosing, no matter how short the notice, or I'll find the shittiest location in the NHS and bury you under it. Am I talking slowly enough for you to keep up?" Yes, boss." Marshall thought better of trying to reason with him and resolved to take it on the chin. Tomorrow would be Shauna's send-off, and he'd be hard-pressed to get there before about 10 at night, but he knew resistance was futile. "You need to make it up to the team, too. Tomorrow's long day gives Kenneth an extra day off, and you owe George at some point. I'll say when." With that, Bundu slammed the receiver home without ceremony. Marshall looked at the handset and frowned. He hooked it back onto the Bakelite body and turned to walk the corridor back to his door. He looked at the busy carpet pattern as he went and turned things over in his head. Not by design, obviously, but he'd earned himself half a Friday, and he figured he'd get a coffee and a cigarette and contemplate what to do with his newfound free time. The kettle hissed and rumbled its way to a boil, and with the cup charged with coffee and sugar, Marshall flicked ash into an ashtray with John Smith's bitter printed around the rim. It was plain enough that the police had no reason to believe what he told them, and he wasn't about to go sharing with anyone else without something concrete to prove he wasn't going round the bend. He stared out the window without really seeing the large lawn and surrounding hedges which ran away to the hospital access road, beyond which were trees which made up the cot fringe hiding the hospital building from his gaze. He could make out one end of the old chapel, the other side of which he knew was the entrance to the courtyard he'd recently nursed his embarrassment in. The kettle clicked, its mundane job done, and he stepped over and poured some of the steaming contents into his cup. He pondered to himself whilst watching the steam rise from the brown liquid, and then stirred and added some milk, before taking a seat in his armchair, grabbing the ashtray as he went. He took a pull on the cigarette and watched the end glow, then he inhaled and let the smoke trickle out of his nostrils. Something occurred to him then. I'm the only person who knows there's anything going on. He realised he'd said this out loud. I need to find something real before I can tell anyone again, something that can't be ignored or ridiculed. That was when he decided what to do with his afternoon. He would go back to the basement. He would find something. After all, where there's smoke there's usually fire, and if what he believed he'd seen was real, there had to be some evidence, some sign, something to anchor his sanity to, right after he finished his stimulant picnic, of course.
When the bass gets moved, couple hits to the face. I know that I need time now, yo, I gotta go and find my way. My name came up a lot, it sounds more when I was not around.
Jimmy was on the telephone in reception. He tapped a big pen against the back of his left hand as he spoke. What would you like me to do with this information, madam? There was a pause while he listened to the caller and continued his tapping. Of course, I will inform Mr. Armitage right after your call. A further pause. More tapping. Yes, that does sound worrisome, madam. I'll make sure he gets the information, of course. Good day to you. Jimmy disconnected the call and dropped the pen onto the desk. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully whilst running his eyes over the wooden surface in front of him, as though searching for something. He sighed loudly before flicking a switch on the console in front of him and then dialing a 3-digit number and listening to the purr of it ring in an extension somewhere. Mr. Armitage, sir. I understand you're a duty nursing officer today. Would that be right? Jimmy knew it was. He had the rosters pretty much down pat by now. Something else he took pride in. Yes, I've just had a call from the County General over at Luxton. A lady by the name of Fuller. Ring any bells? He listened to the reply. Yes, that's the one. She says one of their students didn't return from here on the transport. Wondered if we knew her whereabouts. A young lady by the name of Darla Kafaki. I have a description if it would help. A longer pause this time, which he punctuated with, uh-huh. Then, can I assume you'll speak to the School of Nursing? And, thank you. He flicked a switch to disconnect and then took to rubbing his chin again with renewed vigour. Marshall had changed out of his work clothes and put on jeans and a sweatshirt. He knew the basement would be grubby. He'd borrowed a halogen torch from the cleaner's cupboard, which he knew they often left unlocked, and made his way over to the courtyard and the stairway down. It wasn't long after midday, but he knew this would make little difference to how dingy it would be down there. He didn't hesitate at the top and wasn't masking his presence despite feeling like he should be stealthy. He couldn't explain the feeling. Was it apprehension? Was it cautiousness? He wasn't sure. He reached the flagstone bottom and pulled his passkey from his pocket, poking it into the lock. He registered once again how stiff the lock was as it grated its deadbolt out of the receiver. He turned the handle. The follower scraped too, and there was a faint rush of air as he pulled at the door, and it opened. He clicked on the high-powered torch and stepped inside, pulling the door to behind him. He swung the beam around the small lobby-type room, and the once pale blue walls were flecked with mildew, and there were bubbles of paint here and there. He shone the light through the open door opposite, but there appeared to be a corridor leading to the left and out of view. He sidestepped through the opening and fired the torch in front of him. It was indeed a short corridor, which seemed to open out into a larger room, of which he could see a strip running out to a wall some 15 feet away, with foot-high windows toward the ceiling so covered in dirt and grime that they let in barely any light at all. He pushed on and found the room was about 15 feet square and stretched out to his right as he entered. There were a few bent and broken tubular chairs scattered around. Their PVC upholstery was tattered and stained. The floor was tiled, and there was a roll of carpet lying on the far side of the room against the wall. There were shards of what looked like broken crockery scattered around, and it was all covered in a layer of dirt, which may have been dust before it set this thickly in the damp atmosphere. Not much else to see here. He advanced across the room to a door on the opposite corner. There were a set of lightweight double doors in the wall to his right, which he took to be a cupboard. There were similar storage areas in the wards above ground, and he saw no reason why down here would be much different in that regard. He reached the other door, and as he was trying the handle he noticed a quarter circle of tiles at its bottom were exposed, no dust and grime like the rest of the floor. The door had been opened sometime relatively recently, and he could see a line where the crud had bunched up in the process. Somebody had been down there. His excitement rose, and he felt just a little vindicated, but there was another feeling mixed with it. Excitement, curiosity, something. He put his ear to the door's scarred paint and listened. He could hear air rushing somewhere, but besides that, nothing. He turned the handle gently, like it was a bedroom door, and he was trying not to wake someone. It was in better condition than the entrance door, and it moved more smoothly. He pulled, expecting a creak or something, but there was none, and it swung soundless along the shape it had previously carved. He kept hold of the handle whilst he pushed the torch through the opening in front of him, and the interior of the next space sprung into view. It was a large L-shaped affair, about 70 feet on the two longest sides, with a rectangular section jutting out into the far corner. This section had a door set in its left-hand wall, and the right boasted a serving hatch, much like on the ward where he worked. Sweeping the light beam around, he saw chairs and tables, all wooden, all damaged or rotted, or otherwise unusable. A dining room in a past time, and the structure in the corner was obviously a kitchen. To the right of the hatch, the torch revealed an archway, and he could see into another room, perhaps a lounge or similar. In the left-hand wall, at right angles to the door through which he'd come, was another door, and he tossed an imaginary coin to decide whether to go through it or the archway. The door won, and he shone the torch through the arch one more time before picking his way between the scattered dining furniture to get to the portal. The door was locked. He pointed the beam of the torch at the handle and the keyhole below it. The brass was tarnished, but the gold-like metal glinted under the glare nevertheless. He produced his key yet again and fitted it to the lock, but when he tried to turn it to disengage the deadbolt, it would not turn. He assumed it was unlocked and tried the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. His brain spun scenarios and came up with a theory that the lock was installed upside down, so he turned the key the opposite way. With few soft objects around, the key turned and sounded unnaturally loud, reverberating for a split second, and Marshall heard a chirruping and a scurrying sound, no doubt a rat or other nighttime inhabitant, but the door still wouldn't move. He released the handle and took a half step back, playing his light over the door. At about head height there was a round brass disc, and he recognised it as a night latch of the sort most people have on their front door. It was bright, and unlike the other door furniture, untarnished, and by the looks of it newly installed. That settled things for him. The clean patch of floor he'd seen, and this, meant someone had been down here recently and more than once if they'd taken the time to install a new lock. He could go no further, he knew. He puzzled a moment about what might be on the other side before turning back the way he'd come. There was a scrape, like the sound the hinges had made at the entrance door, and Marshall thought for a minute that the door behind him was opening. He wheeled around and fired the torch beam at it, but it obviously hadn't moved. He watched the handle for a moment to convince himself it wasn't turning, and there was no sign of movement. He listened intently for a second, and the now obligatory dripping in the distance was padded by the sound of draughts swirling around somewhere. But there was something else, a soft, faint tapping, like a clock with an irregular tick. It seemed random at first and unclear, but he listened a little longer, quieting his breathing so it wouldn't interfere. At first, all he heard was his heartbeat whooshing in his ears, but he slowly tuned it out and the tapping was there all right. One tap, then a pause, then 2 taps and another pause, then 3 evenly spaced taps, then silence for what seemed like an age, and then it started again. 1, 2, 3. Not random at all then. His mind struggled to think of a mechanical explanation and came up with nothing plausible. It could only be a person as far as he was concerned, and the problem of gaining access to the room beyond loomed as solid as the door which barred the way. One thing was certain, he wasn't getting past it without a key or some other tool. He turned once more and retraced his path, heading back out towards the old stone steps. As he passed through the old dining room, he was too preoccupied to notice the dark figure crouching at the edge of the archway off to his left, watching him make his way out the door and across the lobby towards the exit.